Thanks to all of you who are here. And I apologize if I'm a little hard to hear. I'm a little bit under the weather, but so thrilled to be here anyway. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Clark Kaplan, and I am the Executive Director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. That one's not good. Okay. And I am thrilled to welcome you to today's talk, Latinx Environmentalisms, Place, Justice, and the Decolonial, a talk on an incredible book that was edited by these four scholars here, who you'll be hearing more about today. Yes. So I want to just start off by saying that today's event is the first of two events that make up our series, Intertwining Roots, Collaborative Anti-Racist Research on Environmental Studies. So this series of events has been a long time planning. In fact, it started when our incredible faculty affiliate of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center came to us last year, David Vasquez, and said, you know, I have this little book that I co-edited, and it seems it's won the first ever award from the Modern Language Association for Best Collected Edition. So we thought that was amazing, and we were super excited to celebrate it. But as it turns out, we found that this event and the events coming with it speak to a larger part of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center's mission. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center is an interdisciplinary hub for the research and practice of racial justice and intersectional liberation. We convene scholars, educators, community-based change makers, cultural workers, and policy advocates in sustainable and equitable collaborations. Now, while we focus on a number of critical issues around racial justice, policy, and political change, our current mission focuses on four critical areas that we believe are crisis points and also points of possible change within the U.S. and transnational sociopolitical structure. And those are educational access and equity, which I think we all know is a crucial issue right now, reproductive justice, race and carcerality, and land, climate, and agricultural justice. So as you can imagine, this event fits right within the key issues that we believe are critical for producing social change, racial justice, and decolonial liberation in this current moment. Beyond that, however, what makes this event so special are the ways in which it fits into one of the ways in which ARPC truly understands our role as a convening entity. Not only do we believe that academic research is crucial, but we also believe that knowledge production for social change is something that occurs within the academy and on the ground, in grassroots movements, community-based organizations, and culture work. That knowledge is produced in diffuse sites, and that only when we bring these different sites of knowledge production together do we have the capacity to produce sustainable and material social change. What makes this volume so very special for us in our event and in our broader attempts to celebrate it are the ways in which it emphasizes one of the key beliefs of ARPC, that while it is absolutely crucial to work towards material structural change, that change can only take place when cultural shifts also occur. Or to put it more simply, that cultural shifts drive structural change. That it is only through shifting discourse, through shifting understandings of culture, through changing ideology that we produce the conditions for policy change that is not simply temporary or remedial, but that actually leads to long-term and large-scale social transformation. That's part of why we find this event so special. We're also incredibly excited for the ways in which Latinx Environmentalisms points towards the other work that we've been doing in moving toward racial justice in environmental, agricultural, and climate areas. Our next project in this area is one that we've also been working on for over a year, which is our toolkit for pointing the Farm Bill toward racial justice. And you'll be hearing more about that in upcoming weeks. Now, that event like this one, that initiative like this one is in fact only possible due to our long-term collaboration with the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, another research center on campus with whom we've been collaborating for over a year in thinking about how to bring a racial justice focus to questions of environmental, climate, and agricultural justice. So in that, we'd like to really move toward actually thanking the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, as well as our other co-sponsors for this event, the Program in Latinx Studies, the Literature Department, the Environmental Studies Department, the Sociology Department, SIS's Department in Environment, Health, and Development, and the Department of Anthropology. Now, as you know, this is the first of two events. Those same set of co-sponsors have also kindly agreed to help sponsor our research workshop tomorrow. That is, for the undergraduates in the room, I'm sorry, an event that is for faculty, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows who are interested in figuring out how they too can pursue the kind of collaborative research and environmental studies that works across disciplinary and research methodological divides to work towards social justice and racial justice. That workshop will be taking place tomorrow with these esteemed panelists, as well as panelists from the Recipes Project at American University, that is housed at American University. And with that event, we'll be offering people an opportunity to get hands-on advice regarding their own attempts to create research collaboratives, not only in terms of how to get research funding, but how to engage with community-based organizations in reciprocal and equitable ways, and how to do that all-important work of getting that research published. So this event would not be possible without the number of people who work for ARPC, CC, and other organizations on campus. So I want to just run through our team very quickly. I'd like to make sure to thank the ARPC team, Justine Williams, our Associate Director for Operations and an expert in her own right in issues of agricultural justice transnationally. You'll be seeing more of her tomorrow as a co-moderator for tomorrow's workshop. Lily Wong, our Associate Director for Faculty, who always is such a critical player in bringing together faculty-led events like this. Our administrative expert in all things, our Assistant for Administration, Nalani Love Harris, who handles all of our event coordination and all of our speaker arrangements. And then, of course, the team from CC who reserved this room for us and helped us make all of this work as well. And of course, last, I'm not going to introduce our amazing panelists, but I am going to thank my colleague, Malini Ranganathan, who is one of the most integral people for us as well. And I'm going to say, while it's not included in her incredible bio that I'm about to read, I want to acknowledge that I owe a special thanks to Malini, which I really try to point out every time I see her. Malini Ranganathan was the interim faculty director for the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center and a member of the search committee who hired me. But more importantly, it was Malini's work that really helped to direct the vision of the center as one that roots in both community and transnational connections, and in the strength of our faculty here at AU as researchers and scholar activists. And so events like this are really only possible because of the vision and leadership that she provided. So we're grateful to have her here as the moderator for this event, as also a climate justice scholar in her own right. Dr. Malini Ranganathan is an associate professor in the Department of Environment, Development, and Health at the School of International Service at American University, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on environmental justice. A political ecologist and critical geographer by training, she studies environmental, land, and housing struggles in the US and India. Here in Washington, D.C., her work looks at the intersections between abolitionist politics, gentrification, and climate justice. She has published over 20 journal articles and 2 books, and won the 2023 Harold M. Rose Award for Anti-Racism Research and Practice from the American Association of Geographers. And with that, I will hand the mic over to her to follow up with this incredible panel. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Malini again. I use she, her pronouns. And you all are in for a treat. I mean, this doesn't happen every day that we have a panel on a book titled Latinx Environmentalisms, focusing on the decolonial, focusing on racial justice. This doesn't happen in this building. This doesn't really happen at AU. So I think this is quite a historic occasion. I'm delighted to see so many students in the room, and I will have you all know that these students aren't going to, let you get away lightly. They're going to ask you some tough questions at the end of this session. We have some terrific student activists in the crowd who are really leading the fight for a climate justice on this campus and, in the US as well. So, with that, I first want to start by congratulating you. The MLA is, of course, no small feat. It's a tremendous honor, so huge congratulations. I also want to start by saying, as a geographer who thinks a lot about environmental justice in cities, in India as also the US, I was struck by how much this book actually resonates with my own work. It resonates, I think, so much because the central premise of this book is not to diversify environmental studies or environmental humanities by sprinkling a Latinx voice here and there, right? We all know that kind of environmental work as well, right? It's not that. And it's also not to bring an environmental lens from the outside to study Latinx histories and narratives, right? But rather, the goal of this book is to show that Latinx storytellers, artists, activists, workers, abuelas, and youth have to some extent always been ecological, have always been attuned to the eco-politics and earthly imperatives of their work. Right? So this is what I find so compelling and that I think you're going to hear a lot about today. And it's such an important contribution to scholarship across the social sciences and humanities. So let me introduce our wonderful panelist, Dr. Sarah Jaquette-Ray, if you could, yep, they're sitting right next to me, Professor and Chair of Environmental Studies at Cal Poly Humboldt. Anyone from California here in this room? Okay, woohoo, California in the house. She's the author of 2 books, in addition to editing this one, The Ecological Other, Environmental Exclusion in American Culture, and A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. She has also co-edited 3 volumes, plus the one we're looking at today, that bridge the environmental humanities and social justice. One of them is called Visibility Studies and the Environmental Humanities, and another is called Critical North Space Nature Theory. And she's working on another edited book that is due out called The Existentialist Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators. My dear colleague, David Vasquez, is Associate Professor of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies and Director, an inaugural director, I'll have you, of the program in Latina, Latino, and Latinx Studies at AU. He is the author of Triangulations, Narrative Strategies for Navigating Latino Identity. He's completing a new book project titled Decolonial Environmentalisms, Race, Genre, and Latinx Culture. Dr. Sarah Wald, well, you actually sat in order, and this is the story, is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and English at the University of Oregon. Anyone from the Pacific Northwest? Woo, yes. Located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Dr. Wald is the author of The Nature of California, Race, Citizenship, and Farming Since the Dust Bowl. She is currently working on a new book titled Environmental Justice Storytelling in the Outdoor Environmental Movement. And finally, Dr. Priscilla Solis Ibarra is Associate Professor in the Department of English at the University of North Texas. Any Texans in the room? Oh, okay, you'll have to hold your own then, where she teaches Chicanx literature and environmental humanities. Her book, titled Writing the Good Life, Mexican-American Literature and the Environment, was chosen for the 2017 Thomas Lyon Award in Western American Literary and Cultural Studies. Her current book project, everyone is so hard at work, called Brown and Green, a Latina ecogenealogy, traces the history of little-known Latina ecological knowledge caretakers as a way to situate herself in the more than human world, as well as her relation to her mother's life story. Okay, so let's get started. I will pose the question occasionally to all of you, and you can choose who to answer. We do have several questions to get through. We also have student questions at the end, so so beware of lots of questions coming your way. But we'll start by, could you just kind of introduce to the audience the major arguments of your book, and specifically, how does the theoretical lens and qualifier of Latinx change the study of environmentalisms and environmental justice? Conversely, what does the label environmentalism contribute to Latinx and Chicanic studies?
Is it on? No. Hello? Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, first of all, Malini, for agreeing to do this, and to ARPC, and especially to Nalani, who is such a hero. There are many things we can tell you about in terms of like the difficult stories of getting here and all that stuff. But I guess, what I would say about the book, we were talking together before the event today, and it's been a minute since this book came out, so we had to kind of refresh ourselves about what the major arguments were. But I would say that you actually characterized it very well in your introduction, which is to say that we were looking to do more than just add voices to an environmental table that is fundamentally sort of oriented around white attitudes and is really not that interested in doing anything more than just sort of slightly diversifying its interests. At the same time, I think collectively, and part of the reason why we sort of coalesced as a group of people who were working together is that we were all sort of individually annoyed at the ways in which Latinx studies and Latinx literature and culture were sort of largely being ignored, right? And so we felt that there were things within the body of literature and culture that we were thinking about and studying that very much self-consciously were thinking about complicated ideas about environment, about space and place, about coloniality, that were sort of deeply intertwined. And so we wanted to bring a critical race and ethnic studies lens to the study of these questions. And we're less interested in sort of thinking about like staging a dialogue per se between Latinx studies and environmental studies, but more that we were thinking about the lens we wanted to apply was Latinx studies, right? And to think through critical race and ethnic studies about environmental questions, which we thought were sort of embedded within anti-capitalist and anti-racist critiques. So I would say that was like one piece of what we were interested in. I think the other piece was this idea of the recovery model, which like I always have to give a big shout out to Priscilla about this because she really was insistent in our process on kind of operating from this standpoint. And I so appreciate that because it helped us to acknowledge the things that are already there, right? The strains that are always already sort of, ecological, but more than that, the ways in which these artists and authors are kind of plucking strings that are resonant with deep environmental values that are fundamentally sort of like, I'm not going to say always anti-capitalist or always anti-racist or always decolonial, but are always sort of working around those ideas, right? So I think that's, I'll stop there and let Sarah jump in. Sarah always says it better than me, so.
That's not true. Is this on? No. Did I just turn it off? No. Is it on now? Okay. I think I really appreciate that framing. Another thing I think we were pushing back against or trying to write against is the framework of environmental justice. Not that there's anything that we critique about environmental justice as a social movement or a framework per se, but that one of the ways that we were encountering environmental justice in the scholarship is any question around race, ethnicity, decolonization got shoved into the framework of environmental justice and kind of became a separate entity off to the side. And we wanted to recognize the way the literature and film and art and activism that we were encountering exceeded environmental justice and was doing something that was both inclusive of environmental justice, but wasn't reducible to it. And I think that was another through line that brought us together as we were having our initial conversations about the need for such a work and the possibilities of developing this project together.
much. So let's dwell on this idea of the recovery model for a second. So the question that they're really interested in is how can scholars, right, environmental humanists, recognize the ways that diverse groups have always been environmental, so to recover, to unearth, to uncover those ethics that at play that aren't legible to, let's say, a liberal environmentalism as environmental, but actually are doing such important work. So if you read this book, the preface is written by a wonderful scholar and personal mentor of mine called Laura Pulido. And we read her in my course, Environmental Justice 620, which I'm teaching next semester, so please tell your friends. But Pulido writes in the preface that there are kind of tricky ethics at play here. And she wants to name them because it's something she's grappled with herself, which I think is just so honest. She says, what are the ethics of naming someone or a community as environmental who don't themselves choose that label or who have long been labeled against their will? So can you walk us through your own conversations, the sort of behind the scenes about what that recovery model means? And maybe I'll kick it back to you, Priscilla, since you were one of the instigators on this model.
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, Laura Pulido, her work is instrumental to all of this work. To my first book, if I wasn't able to read her work, I wouldn't have been able to write my first book. And I think that we're really building on her trailblazing in this field. So that's one thing. The other thing is when we first read her foreword to the book, we were absolutely blown away and so thrilled. And in terms of the genre of the foreword, it challenges the boundaries of that, and we wouldn't expect anything less from Laura Pulido. A foreword is often like, come and read this book. These are all the ways that it's great. And she does that. She entices the reader, but she entices the reader in a way that's kind of challenging to the project that we're doing too. And we were really, really happy with that, really thrilled with that. So taking up this question, I really take it very seriously, and I think that one of the things that it speaks to is the way that our project is responding to a lot of the invisibility or the erasure from the environmental side of this equation, right? So I think that one of the things that we're trying to do is create the conditions for Latinx environmentalism to emerge. And in cultivating those conditions, I think it's possible to overstep. I think it's possible to perhaps put a label on something that, or someone who might not take up that label themselves. But I feel like that's something to pay attention to then, right? That the creativities and the writers, the ways of being and thinking that work like this documents exists in excess of the categories that have been possible, at which they can identify with, or that scholars can identify them with. So this is part of the process. So certainly I would not want to put this label on someone that wouldn't own it, but I also want to create conditions for existence to emerge, and then we pay attention to how that is emerging. That's one way of responding to that, but if someone wants to add.
Hello. Okay, thank you. The point of entry for me that got us connected, that of course Pulido's work was really influential to me too, because my background was also in geography, and so I connected with Pulido's work through geography. In fact, it was a political ecologist, Diana Davis, who convinced me to go study environmental studies, and so it was through her I was introduced to questions of justice, And she had said to me, maybe you should consider the environment as a way to think about social justice. And I didn't realize I was going to be walking into a field that was so predominantly white, right? So the environmental field that I walked into, thanks to Diana Davis, wasn't what I was expecting. And so then for me, it was a project then henceforth in graduate school, which is how I connected with David, to figure out how to get justice into the environmental stuff better. And so for me, I came to the project a little bit differently. And my interest in Ana Castillo's work, which is my essay in here, my thinking about Polito's comment that you beautifully quoted, has to do with thinking about the ways that people leverage or distance themselves or place themselves in relationship to, in some strategic way, to the privileges afforded to mainstream environmentalism. So what I mean by that is sometimes identifying as an environmentalist or somehow closer to nature can be extremely effective for a particular community. And so we know about Spivak talking about strategic essentialism in terms of feminism and the sort of identifying as female, but I was really thinking about how people use white environmentalism in similar ways to leverage power, to organize, to build coalition, to be legible to the mainstream. And I wanted to pick apart how that was happening with a lot of different texts I was reading in an English department, from Leslie Marmon Silko to Castillo to all kinds of people. And I found it so interesting how people kind of, you're going to ask this question later about the interviews, but the ways that the different people in the book that were interviewed either identified or didn't, right, the way that Polito was talking about. And to me, that's fascinating, right? Why would you want to join and why would you want to distance yourself, in what different contexts and what different moments and different types of audiences? And to me, that is not just a kind of essential, that is your identity and you're choosing it or not. To me, it's very political, very, very strategic, and I wanted to trace a little bit of that. And so to me, the recovery aspect of how do we walk this fine line between recovering things as ecological that may not have been legible to the mainstream versus the problems of putting a label on it, right? There's this tension that everyone has been just talking about that Priscilla just beautifully described. To me, I was less interested in that question, although I became very interested in learning about all of these other conversations we were having. But the use of, from different identity categories and power and positionality positions, when somebody would want to or not want to claim environmentalism. So that was another way that we were thinking about Polito's comment there.
So for the students in the room, when academics typically get together to write an edited book, to edit a volume, they will curate the chapters and they will give editorial and substantive comments, and then they typically write an introduction and then they get their name on the front cover. In this particular case, each of these editors, right, which I think really shows that this is a collective labor of love, right? And it's also, it's really their intellectual creativity and input that also created the volume as a whole, right? And so what they each do is they some of them write chapters, some of them actually do interviews with these luminary Latinx activist writers, creators. And so what I'd like to ask them to do now is to tell you about these folks. So we'll go in turn, and what I want you to do is, tell us about this person, and what about the interview with them surprised you? What did you learn? So we'll start with Priscilla and Sarah Wald, who did a profile, an interview with Ana Castillo. So who is Ana Castillo?
I think you should go first, and I want to give an answer.
So Ana Castillo is a writer who comes from Chicago, and one of the things that we learned, this is still background, but we'll talk about the interview too, but one of the things that I learned in the process of interviewing her is that her training is in the visual arts and not in writing, when I know her primarily as a writer, as a poet and novelist. So she's been publishing since the 1980s at least, poetry and novels, and one of her very well-known novels in terms of environmental writing is her novel So Far From God, that's set in New Mexico. So she's based out of New Mexico and Chicago, and she spent some time in California as well. Another thing that we learned when we were interviewing her, that she went out there in search of the United Farm Workers labor organizing movement, and became good friends with Dolores Huerta. And these were all things that emerged during the conversation. So we interviewed her at American Studies Association conference in Chicago, and she was visiting home, and we just kind of crossed paths with her there. And one of the things that we did is we asked everyone an initial question, which is, to what degree do you identify as an environmentalist? It was just kind of something that I was curious about, and we got kind of different answers from everyone, but the predominant pattern was that they did not identify as environmentalists. And in one way that was gratifying for me, because in my first book, I kind of make the argument that the Mexican-American and Chicanx writers who I profile in that book do not identify as environmentalists. But then when you talk about Viramontes, we'll talk about a slightly different answer that she gave, which was itself thrilling too. So I'll pass to Sarah to talk a little more about the interview, which, by the way, like sitting and talking to someone that you've admired for so long, the number of questions that occurred to me between questions that I get to ask was just like mind-blowing. It's just like, I don't know, visually representing that. It was just like all of these fireworks going off in my head, and I was like, oh, I have to pick one tiny spark out of that whole like fireworks show to ask the next question. It was quite overwhelming.
To paint the scene for you a little bit, we're at a conference, we're in her hotel room, sort of in these weird ways academic things happen in hotel rooms where you're all sort of like perched on beds. So true. And I froze. So Priscilla had to like take up the mantle because I unexpectedly got a level of starstruck where I like was having a hard time formulating sentences. I want to touch on the UFW moment, because that is something that recurred across interviews. And on one hand, it makes a lot of sense, right? You sort of think about a group of writers, artists, activists that come of age in a certain moment. Many of these authors we wrote are sort of luminaries of Chicana feminism. They are a kind of cohort, even if they don't, some ways recognizable, in some ways with some divisions among them. So it makes sense that the UFW would have been a foundational moment, but actually having interview after interview or reading and editing and just being like, oh, these women were actually all in the same place, in the same time, at the same social movement, I think really struck me. And I think two takeaways for me for that moment is, one, the ways that we tend to think about social movements as outside of artistic and literary analysis, but many of the people who were studying in arts and literature and other cultural productions are active in these movements and are organizers and are politicized through their organizing work. And many organizers are themselves creatives. And the ways in which the UFW and the farm workers movement has been positioned and erased in the environmental movement, to the point that we still, most people who have an answer to why was DDT banned or where did the environmental movement start will go to Rachel Carson and not the UFW, which got DDT banned in California before there was a federal ban. And when we talk about the first Earth Day, UFW organizers were part of the planning of the first Earth Day throughout the nation. And so I think it really emphasized that particularly Chicanx environmentalism has been at the center of the modern environmental movement and has been actively erased and obscured. And I think without the interviews, I don't know if that point would have hit home as much for me.
Thank you. So I'll turn to David and Sarah Wald on Helena Maria Viramontes.
Yeah, so yes, like everything that everybody's saying. This is what's so great about working with this particular group of people is like, I feel like at times when it's going really well, we're kind of like sharing like this collective sense or something. I don't know how to describe it, but it's like, you know, you mentioned the kind of collaborative and, you know, the sort of deep love and all that sort of stuff. And like, I feel that around this piece. And I feel that when we get to do these things together. So, yeah, so Viramontes is a novelist and also a poet. And one of the sort of, with Castillo and Gloria Anzaldúa and others, like one of the true OGs of Chicana feminism. And the most surprising thing when Sarah and I, we did a phone call with her and recorded the phone call, and we got on the phone with her, and you know, we asked the first question, do you consider yourself an environmentalist? And she was like, yes. And let me tell you, you know, like, and she went on to tell us about this experience that she had had as a high school student in 1969 during the blowouts, for those of you that know that history of the Chicano movement in Los Angeles, at Garfield High, which was like the epicenter of all this stuff. And she took this ecology class with this like progressive hippie teacher in the 1960s and did like this anti-toxics campaign and like went around the neighborhood and like doing petition work and this stuff. And she was like, why hasn't anybody ever asked me this? And we were like, we were kind of wondering the same question, you know? So, but it was so interesting to hear this sort of deep sort of history of her own activism and environmental work that she's like very self-conscious about and has like continued to the present. You know, she's still out there doing all sorts of interesting things. And if you read her novels, like they are so saturated with environmental ideas and they're so interesting. And I think that was sort of like the genesis of all of this work for me, because my first book wasn't really oriented around environmental studies, and Sarah can tell you, like, I was very skeptical of like the whole thing for like many of the same reasons that the people that we approached were, like, because I didn't identify with the whiteness of environmental studies, and so as I was hanging out with all these people at my previous institution who were doing work in the field, I was like, why aren't you talking about Under the Feet of Jesus? And they were like, well, I don't know, like, what are you to talk about? I was like, I guess I will, you know? So, so that's kind of where all of this came from. And then Sarah and I worked together on her dissertation, and Sarah Wald and I met at a conference, and then Priscilla, we were trying to remember when we met last night, but apparently I asked her to be on a panel, and, you know, and so this whole thing sort of happened. But all of that is to say, like, there's a kind of resonance that I think we heard in a lot of the interviews that really confirmed our feelings. And I have to say, like, this was another piece of this collection that I was a little bit skeptical about, because I was like, who cares what the artists think? Like, that's not really what we do in, you know, lit crit. And I think it was you, Sarah, who was really insistent about this. And I was like, okay, well, let's do this. And I'm so glad we did, because I felt like this was some of the deepest learning I was able to do in the collection. And it really taught me that when you go back to the people who have been doing this work, like, they actually know a lot, right? And like, we oftentimes get confused about our relationships as scholars, you know? And it was a really important experience for me to be able to kind of reflect on, you know, the fact that these are folks who have been doing this for almost as long as I've been alive, and have been engaging in the kind of work that, like, you know, that's what I want to do. I want to amplify that work as a scholar. And so I think, like, that moment with Viramontes was like one of those moments where I was like, yes, this is like, because I think we called each other afterwards and we were like, oh my God, can you believe what she said? You know, so, but I'll shut up now and let Sarah talk, so.
So it's hard for me to overstate the influence Helena Maria Viramontes has had on my life. When I was an undergraduate, Lawrence Buell's The Environmental Imagination, which is like this key book in eco-criticism, had just come out, and I was really taken with it. And one of my professors said, you have to read Under the Feet of Jesus. You'd love this novel. And that novel changed my life and is probably the reason I'm doing the work I'm doing now, because it offered such a radically different way of thinking about the environment than I had encountered before, and sort of shifted the trajectory in many ways of the kind of work I was doing, which meant being able to have that conversation with Viramontes was influential in such a different way. And I think part of what was at the center of our desire to talk to authors and artists is, as literary critics and other kinds of scholars that deal with literature, we recognize that these authors are producing theory, and it's not always recognized as theory. And I think having those interviews draws out the theory of them. And a moment in the interview that really will always stick with me is when we started asking about Under the Feet of Jesus, which is one of her many novels, focused on farm workers, and she started talking about the environmental knowledge that the characters Estrella and Alejo had, that they held in their bodies, and the way that she was envisioning what environmental knowledge is and what the role of the body is in relationship to knowledge was at the cutting edge of what many folks were saying who were doing theory, and yet here it was embedded in this novel that at that point was 20-some years old. And it just, I would say that was probably out of all the interviews the moment that like most sits with me still.
So Priscilla, would you tell us about Sherry Moraga?
Absolutely. Sherry Moraga is from Los Angeles, grew up at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains, and it largely identifies as a playwright, but she's also co-editor with Gloria Anzaldúa of this Bridge Called My Back, collection of women of color feminist work that's really a breakthrough moment in American literary history. And she has written a lot of work that speaks directly to ecological, environmental issues. Her play, Heroes and Saints, is one of the landmark works, I think, in environmental justice literature, farm worker literature. So I first met her work in 1997. I was a brand new graduate student at UCLA, and one of our professors, instead of asking us to buy our books at the campus bookstore, sent us down to the Sisterhood bookstore in Westwood.
Sorry. I work there.
And I was kind of grumbling about it because I was like, it's so much easier just to go all to one place. And I walked into the Sisterhood bookstore and I was like, oh my God, this feels like home. I love this place. And I walked back to the textbook room, and there was a book with an illustration by Esther Hernandez, whose work is written about by another scholar in our volume. And the cover of The Last Generation by Sherry Moraga has an indigenous woman wearing a rebozo and holding the planet Earth in her hands like this. And I just saw that cover. I didn't know anything about Sherry Moraga. I didn't know anything about Esther Hernandez. Even though I was from Texas, I did not grow up reading Mexican-American or Chicano literature. Even as an English major, as an undergraduate, I did not know that you could study Mexican-American or Chicano literature until I got to graduate school. But that cover just spoke to me. So the class that I went to get my books for that day, I didn't buy all of them. I was one book short for that class, and then I bought that book instead. And I sat down and read it cover to cover, and that's the book that changed my life. And I was like, oh, well, this is what I'm going to write my dissertation about. But it just took me, about a decade and a half to do everything that I thought I needed to do, all my homework, because as I just told you, I didn't know anything about my own history, about Mexican-American history or literary history, to get to the point where I felt like I could sit down and have a conversation with Sherry Moraga about everything that she was writing about in that book. But I knew that when I read it, that I needed to know everything that I needed, that I had to know in order to talk to her about that. So I showed up at her house one morning, and I didn't leave until 4 or 5 hours later. And at a certain point that day, she said to me, "Don't you have to go to the bathroom or something?" Because she said, "I'll just keep answering questions until you stop asking me questions." I was like, all right, then let's go. So it was amazing to get that chance to talk to her at her home in Oakland. And I was just thrilled by the whole thing, and I recorded it, and then I spent the rest of that evening walking around. I was staying in Berkeley, walking around Berkeley, listening to to the conversation again. It was raining, and I was just walking around thinking, yes, or what? I don't understand that, and trying to figure everything out. So it was that was a powerful experience, and I guess, something that was not necessarily like surprising, but I just loved hearing about it was the way that she personified her relationship with the land, and that the land knows your body recognizes the land. That part of the conversation was just like so fulfilling to me and mind-blowing to me, so it was an amazing experience.
This is a real nerdy panel, right? I mean, having transformative experience in bookstores, it's all wonderful. Well, so Sarah Ray, does something a little bit different from the other scholars you just heard from who did interviews. Speaking of books that change lives, there are several references throughout the book, but especially in Sarah's chapter, to Ana Castillo's a book titled So Far From God. So, why is this book important? Because now it's entering my queue of books to read.
Okay. Well, so first of all, I just cannot believe we have that sisterhood bookstore connection. That is so cool. Okay, I'm going to talk about that later. Okay. There were, as I was going into my dissertation, as I was thinking about what are going to be my research questions, what am I going to do with this stuff I just told you about earlier, trying to bring social justice closer into environmentalism, one of the things that I discovered was that a lot of people in the environmental spaces that I was operating in couldn't figure out why it is that they couldn't get more diverse, right? And they sort of naively or ignorantly or also as a form of the invisibility of their own privilege to themselves, just refused to do that kind of examination as to why it is that a lot of different people didn't feel like joining into their movement or into the studies or any other spaces for that matter. And so my research question that ended up being my first book and my dissertation was this question of, well, wherefore this schism, right? Why are all of these tensions happening? And the vast majority of people who are doing kind of EJ kind of thinking in those spheres we're trying to lay out all the reasons for connection, right? Like let's theorize why social justice and environmental issues should be connected. And that wasn't as much of an interesting question to me as much as a question of, well, why hasn't it already happened? Where are the points of tension? We can't just theorize how hunky-dory, like deep ecologists would say that we should all get along or whatever. There's some actual history here, and I wanted to excavate that a little bit. That was what the ecological other was about, trying to trace this kind of genealogy of those schisms and across lots of different communities, but to sort of draw a thread of connection that the environmental movement had sort of systematically, deliberately, and as a main part of environmentalist history in the US especially, had actually actively been part of very exclusionary moments. So that was the main gist of it. So how did Ana Castillo come into it? Ana Castillo's book, to me, when I read it, was very much speaking to that. Ana Castillo was very much flagging in So Far From God, hello, environmentalists, what are you doing? You're screwing up here, you're screwing up here, you're screwing up here. And Polito's beautiful essay about the Hispanic grazing in the Southwest was absolutely being taken up in a fictional form in So Far From God. So there's a great, beautiful connection between Polito's work and So Far From God. Polito studying it from a political ecology, human geography perspective, very much nonfiction, and Castillo talking about it from this very fictional perspective, and to put them into conversation with each other just blew my mind. And I had to write about it. And it was actually part of my original dissertation, but in turning it into a book, editors, et cetera, sort of moved it out. And when Dave Vasquez and I, when we were all starting talking about this book, we were thinking, this is so great. We can find some home for this piece on Ana Castillo because I loved So Far From God. And And I could go on and on. There's multiple things that's happening in that book, but the sort of main thing that I find very interesting is this moment of speaking directly to the mainstream environmental movement and saying, here are the ways that you are excluding other communities and have actually participated in our oppression. And the grazing was the sort of moment of that happening, right? That this sort of grazing was considered anti-environmental. And so it was very much a, hey, the ways that we are in touch with the land, you are now criminalizing, or you are now saying is unenvironmental. And so this concept of being an ecological other, which is the title of my first book, came through in that example in the text. There's also this moment at the end where there's this procession at the end of the novel where the grazing community is saying something like, hey, we're like the whales. You want to save the whales, but you don't care about us, right? And that's a move that we hear a lot of social justice movements making. That's a particular kind of trope or move that sort of signals the power of mainstream environmentalists, that they actually have some kind of stake in other people's well-being or thrivability or whatever. And to me, that was a real indictment of the mainstream environmentalism movement to say, if you can care more about whales than you care about us, then you cannot talk about social justice, right? That is super hypocritical. So there was that moment in the procession where they're saying, hey, we're endangered too. This language of endangerment and the kind of prioritizing of charismatic species over vulnerable populations was an aspect of Castillo's work that I thought, she can't possibly say she's not interested in environmental themes, but absolutely I can imagine her saying, I don't identify as an environmentalist, because she was absolutely taking them to task in the book. So I don't know if that fully, I'll stop there.
Can I add just one thing, which is that the cover art for our book was actually created by Ana Castillo, and Priscilla was really instrumental in getting her to agree to let us use that work. And we're just, when we saw the image, we were like, yes, that is the one. And she gave us actually several, all of which were really awesome. But we really are so grateful to her for allowing us to use that piece of artwork.
Yeah, when we were interviewing her and she said, I'm a visual artist, and she was actually at that moment, she was saying that she couldn't write and she was doing mostly visual work. And I made a major note to myself, like ask her if I can see some of that work for the cover, possibly. And it took a while, but it all worked out, yeah.
So this book has the D word in it. Anyone know what I'm talking about? The D word? Decolonization. We can't say it right on this campus. I mean, I literally think the FBI are like waiting for us right out there. In fact, they might be in this room.
It's her fault. She said it first.
So, decolonization, right? It's become a bad word on university campuses, on American streets, perhaps, all over the world. This book is about decolonization, decolonizing what we think of as the environment, right? And it both builds on and departs from a very well-known, now canonical article by Tuck and Yang called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And some of you may have read that our colleague Eve Tuck has now been the subject of a lot of hate as an indigenous scholar for supposedly being anti-Israel. And she's just been hired into NYU. She's a wonderful scholar, has really contributed a lot to our thinking on decolonization by this provocative article. But sort of coming back to the book, right? That is one very important perspective on decolonization, coming from indigenous scholar and ally who sort of disrupts settler colonialism and whiteness in that piece. Settler moves to innocence also, which is a very fascinating term. This book kind of takes that theoretical framing and activist framing in a different direction, also calling out that for Latinx groups, right, they're in a bit of a predicament because as compared to Native Americans or indigenous groups, Mexican people, for instance, have both been complicit in the theft of native land historically, even as they have also been subject to colonial dispossession themselves, right? Which leads us in a really interesting, potentially contradictory, but also, I think, a really important positionality to examine. So can you talk a little bit about the D word? What scholarship guides your understanding of decolonial in this book? And how do you think your book actually then talks back to scholarship on decolonization?
I think there's lots of directions that we can go in this conversation. And this is a very, very important discussion, and it's really central to most of the conversations that we've had following up on this work. This is the part of this project that I think in different ways we're all taking up the challenge of amplifying this moment in the book. So one thing to flag here is that it's very problematic to generalize the Latinx identity period, right? Yet we're doing it, right? The title of our book is Latinx Environmentalisms. So we kind of, do it at the same time that we have to keep in mind that this demographic is just incredibly complex. The whole conversation about critical Latinx indigeneity is just, one part of this discussion, but this is the aspect of my work that I've really been amplifying and reading up on, learning all about Latinx indigeneity and ways that, and this is, to be honest, part of what I really feel like I would have liked to amplify more about my first book as well, about Mexican-American environmental writing, and talk more about indigenous identity and aspects of indigenous cultures on which I build a lot of my arguments about how Mexican-American culture is ecological. So, that's one way in which to continue to follow up on this aspect of what is decolonial about this book and what's problematic about the decoloniality of this book, the decolonial theory that we build on. But there's just absolutely no way that we can make this argument about Latinx environmentalisms without the analytic of the decolonial. And that was instrumental to the way that I articulated the argument of my book in 2016, and still in 2019, I don't think that we could have pulled this together without that analytic, just as urgently as I think it's important for us to discuss the complexity of that analytic in 2023, just 4 years later.
One thing I think I might offer as framing here for those who haven't read the book is two particular tensions that I think we're all unsatisfied with how we dealt with it, but we, I think, succeeded in naming in the text. One is the tension between the way the decolonial gets taken up in Latin American studies, which is broadly about the confronting the kind of Cartesian split, the sort of mind-body, the sort of all the kind of discussions against the binary that we encounter, and the sort of what does it mean to decolonize the imagination, what does it mean to deal with this sort of epistemic violence, versus the land back emphasis of the Tuck and Yang article that really is on one hand about land is back as being, it's not decolonial if you're not asking for land back, and is also then confronting the way that any case for racial justice has gotten miscalled decolonial work when it really has nothing to do with, right? White supremacy is part of colonization, but you can confront racial injustice without confronting settler colonialism. So that tension between the ways that Native American studies and Latin American studies had think about what it means to do decolonial work is centered and named, but not really, we aren't able to offer a path forward other than to sit in the tension. And I think the other key tension that I think actually because of scholarship that have come out since then, have a better way of dealing with is how to think about indigeneity in a Latinx studies context where Latinx as an identity marker is so heterogeneous that there's folks who have different relationships to indigeneity and different relationship to settler colonial, including folks who have ongoing relationships with indigenous communities versus folks who have an indigenous heritage that has been lost, and versus folks who have identities that aren't in no ways indigenous. And I think there's been some really great scholarship on that didn't exist when we were writing, that I think would have helped us do more than just name that tension.
And I also think that we were working on another aspect of this, which was that the ways in which indigeneity has been taken up by mainstream environmentalism, which is oftentimes like very much oriented around like ecological Indians, or this sort of essentialization of people who are close to the land. And we saw many of the authors and artists that we were working with as resisting those ideas, while at the same time like asserting very stringently their like unique forms of knowledge that they actually had to bear. So that was also a piece of it. But I want to really echo Sarah's point about the kind of material critique that Tuck and Yang have versus the more epistemological one that people like Walter Mignolo and Quijano and that crowd have been thinking about. And we, I think in some ways, they're talking about two sides of similar issues, right? And so we saw the volume as an opportunity to put those two ways of thinking into conversation in ways that we weren't seeing at that time. And I think it was like, I wouldn't say that we were all completely 100% satisfied with the ways in which the kind of conversation emerged in the volume. But I think given like what we had at the time and the ways we had to think and the theoretical tools we had, it was a really important move for us to make, to sort of think about those two things together in ways that we hadn't thought about them before. And then, like Sarah said, the authors and artists like confirmed a lot of this thinking in those interviews where they were really sort of theorizing these kinds of connections, and we were just sort of like putting on the glasses to sort of better understand what they were saying. But they were the ones who were really sort of doing this. So we saw it kind of moving in multiple ways, and it is that recovery model was so important for us because we were trying to identify that which was already there, but also to understand the ways in which that which was already there is like participating in and pushing conversations in ways that we're not usually trained to see them, right? So I'll stop there.
Okay, well, we are at 3:35, and I have one more question that I'll ask David, because I think that his chapter is unique in that he focuses on the history of the Young Lords, which is a Puerto Rican youth movement, right, in New York, and it sort of departs from the majority of studies that they or novels and creative works that they examine, which are Chicanics, right? So I would like to ask you about that, and then I'm going to put one question on the table for you to all consider and think about while I then turn it over to students, and you can choose to sort of weave in your answer because it's a very broad question. So I guess just finally, David, because we haven't heard about this story yet, if you could tell us, what does it mean to tell the story of the Young Lords' fight against gentrification as an urban environmental struggle that's different from the struggles of the United Farm Workers movement, right, out in California, that are more rural and farm-based, right, to actually sort of bring that that place-based analysis here that disrupts typical mappings of, let's say, Latinx struggles always happen on farms. They don't. They also happen in cities. So what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I also want to give a shout out to Randy Ontiveros, who is here and was a contributor and as a professor at UMD and who wrote a beautiful chapter on poetry in the suburbs, which is another geographic space that we were interested in. So this is a great question, and I want to say first, so for those of you who don't know who the Young Lords were, they were a group of youth activists, as Malini points out, that began in Chicago, actually, but then sort of moved to New York City. They were a street gang initially that kind of politicized and became this really important part of the Puerto Rican movement, which was a kind of analogous movement in the Northeast to the Chicano movement of the Southwest. In many ways, the Young Lords were like among the most progressive social movement actors during this period. If you can go and look at their 14-point platform, it's up on the internet, and among the many points in their platform that they advocated for were safe environments. They offered free lead testing. They offered child care services. They were against gentrification. They were for the empowerment of women. So they were like really interesting, but I think the thing that I found really interesting and compelling, so I sort of read the residues of the Young Lords in a novel called Bodega Dreams by Ernesto Quiñones. And in that novel, Quiñones is very much thinking about these sort of historical residues and what it means to do activist work and what it means particularly to do anti-gentrification work in urban spaces. And he sort of harkens back to these moments of activism in the 1960s that the Young Lords were partially the architects of. So I think, in terms of like geographical space, it became really important for me because I had thought about, I wrote about Viramontes as well, and I had thought about placing that chapter in this volume because through a whole series of things that happened in academic publishing, it had been headed towards a journal and then didn't go, and it was sort of floating. And anyways, I published it elsewhere, but as we talked about what I would contribute, I had this other piece on Quiñones that I really wanted to think about, and I felt two things. One was that if we think about the natural environment for human beings, like cities actually are where a lot of people live, right? And so they are natural environments. We had a couple of close encounters with rats last night too, so there are even creatures in the city. It became like a key kind of space for us to think about in the collection, because I think so much of the ways that we identify Latinx environmentalisms does go to those sort of like recognizable environmental forms, right? Which are oriented around rural environments, farm workers, and those kinds of things. And we're like, there's more to say here, right? And there's more to think about. And also, cities are environments, and it's part of the Cartesian split to think about them as not the environment, right? So, and when they do get thought of in environmental context, it's often in terms of like environmental problems like toxicity or like, greenwashing and all those sorts of things, right? So to think about housing equity as an aspect of environmental thinking became really important for me, because I think, if we are truly thinking about decoloniality as a lens, then these things are all sort of bound up together, right? Like you cannot have capitalism without colonialism, without the slave trade, without, the institution of racial hierarchies. And, the way that looks in cities is often in terms of housing segregation or housing shortages, or the predation of cheap housing by empowered actors. So, I mean, I can talk more about that if people want to ask in the Q&A, but that was sort of the kind of crux of the thing for me.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the students to join the conversation and ask their questions. The one question I sort of was pondering after I finished this book that I wanted to ask you all that maybe you can weave into your answers is, did you come away from this project feeling more hopeful or less hopeful about the term environmental? Despite the fact that it is continues to be steeped in white privilege and colonial epistemologies, right? Despite the fact that today we see various forms of consumerist or neoliberal environmentalism, despite assaults on environmentalism from, let's say, the far right, like the twerps on TV last night, do you find merit to this term, right? Okay, so. Do you want to ask a question?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to kind of piggyback off of what Malini was asking, and then I'm just going to bring in the student questions, right? So our first student is Ella. Do you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you so much for talking with us today. This has been such a pleasure, and I've been looking forward to this event for months. So I'm very, very excited. My question for you all is, what is the most significant but realistic step that intersectional environmental activists can take to decolonize the environmental movement? So basically, what are real things that we can do that aren't just theoretical, that will make real world impacts on the movements that we're in or the movements that we've kind of been forced to be in?
Do you want to take 2 or 3 together, or do you want to do let's do one at a time, actually. Okay, we'll get to that.
I've got an answer, but I want to hear yours first.
Okay. That's a great question. Thank you. I think that, well, let me talk about these 2 questions kind of together. In terms of the degree to which I remain hopeful about the term environmental, I think that I engage with it as an analytic now rather than a way to, rather than as an identity. It's not, when it's used as an identity, when it's, when people position themselves, you know, to what degree they are or are not, I feel like it creates too much space for there to be someone who is, who can imagine themselves as not being part of the world, right? that it's someone else's responsibility. So I feel like as an analytic, as saying that, okay, this is a way that we've been, it's an era of time in which we have been shaping this narrative, then I gain some distance from it, and then we can engage with it and deconstruct it. So that's what I'm thinking in terms of, you know, environmentalism, and I think it connects to the question about concrete steps. I think that we're really in a time in which critical solidarities are important and are really need to be at the forefront of so many of the things that we do. And I think part of our methodology here with this project and ongoing projects is putting together teams of people that don't necessarily always agree, and making sure that you're teaming up with people who kind of come from different angles at things, so that you practice that critical solidarity kind of muscle everywhere, right? So a concrete step would be if you're in a space where kind of everybody's agreeing all the time, then, or everybody's coming at something from a similar angle, that means that space, there's not enough different voices there, right? So cultivating a variety of voices, contributions to anything that you're approaching. And I think it's, you know, this is an academic exercise, right? Putting together a collection. Writing a syllabus, whatever, you know, but it's important whatever space that we're in to cultivate those solidarities. That's just like one concrete step.
I really love this question. And for me, you know, I really came to academia out of an organizing activist background. And I have always felt like there's a dialectic between scholarship and social movements. I am forever learning from social movements, and social movements end up driving a lot of the questions I ask and the urgency of those questions. And also, I ended up back in graduate school because of the ways I felt the most urgent questions weren't being answered in the movements that I've been a part of. And I think we see that dialectic and its possibilities at work in the writing of someone like Adrienne Murray Brown's Emergent Strategies, and then that's I think a really exciting place to look for what we can be doing now. And I really appreciate this, the coalitional politics that Priscilla talks about. I also really want to draw on Priscilla's wisdom, and that one of the things that I've heard Priscilla say, I think we're all overwhelmed by all the many things we can be doing and the many movements. To identify what your passion is and what role you can play, and even if that can change that in that moment, and sort of don't lose sight of that. So for me, I've ended up doing a lot of work in the mainstream environmental movement with workshopping some of these ideas, because I have a certain legitimacy because of my own background from the 90s in some of these spaces to have hard conversations. But for somebody else, that positionality in the movement is going to be different, and moving into these larger coalitional politics, you might have a different place. So I think not feeling the pressure to do everything and be everything, but figure out what particularly can you contribute towards these movements for justice and focus energy there.
Yeah, I'll just add one very small thing, maybe not such a small thing, but like an important thing. And that is that it's really important to cultivate hope. Like, it's super duper important, and I continue to find myself in spaces we were talking about this at lunch today, where people are like, "Oh, we're so screwed. We're so screwed. We're so screwed," and it's like, yes, but like we screwed ourselves, so like we need to unscrew ourselves, and so like I think the idea that that we're just hopeless, like. That's the hustle that capitalism and colonialism wants us to believe, so that we fundamentally don't have to change anything, that we can just sort of like go down the drain together or whatever, which is really like, because like, the really rich people, they don't actually believe they're going to go down the drain, right? Like they know that they have a backup plan, whether it's like going to Mars or whatever, so. But I think that for us, and how I would dovetail it with the question is that it became really, like, not so much about environmentalism, but the idea of hope in doing this work and like cultivating spaces and in like actively pushing against, through that kind of hopeful action was really important. And I will also say that like collaboration, which we're going to talk more about tomorrow, became a practice of hope for me, and became a practice of thinking beyond. Because like, like the plain truth of the matter is like, I would not be smart enough to write this book on my own. But with these three people, like, we were able to do something that I couldn't do on my own. And that I think push against so many of the things that we're trained to do in this kind of work, in this kind of space. Like, we're all supposed to be doing these things like alone in our office with our heads down, like sort of cranky, walking around like this all the time. And, like, and I think that part of what we discovered is that, no, actually, this can be joyful work. Like, we can care for each other. We can do the kinds of things that that actually make us feel good. And that actually move us forward in substantive ways. So like, I think like bringing joy and hope to the work is like some of the most important stuff we can do.
Yeah, my answer really segues from that. So thank you. Yeah. This is often a question, sort of take your scholarship, Sarah, and can you what's the thing I can do? And for all of his faults, Bill McKibben was famously asked, often, what's the one thing I as an individual can do? And in a moment of frustration, he said, the number one thing you can do is stop being an individual. And I'd say that my answer piggybacks on that. I'm just citing him just so I don't pretend I made it up myself, but he certainly didn't make it up himself either. This notion that, sorry, no shade on Bill, but some a little bit sometimes. So the part of the sort of ethos that the climate movement historically has emerged out of, as with the mainstream environmental movement, has been this steeped in the same sort of fishbowl water swimming in culture of individualism as mainstream American culture. And so the notion of how we're going to go solving climate problems or environmental problems has also emerged from that same way of thinking. And many other social movements that are cited heavily in our book and that experts on this panel know a lot about have non-individualistic ways of approaching social problems. And I'd say that the one biggest correction that the climate movement is undergoing, and I'm not saying it hasn't started, it certainly has tried, has been this correction or this critique of individualism. And I know that sounds really abstract and theoretical, but I was going to cite Adrienne Maree Brown's book, so Sarah, you got this, yes, go get that book if you haven't read it yet. Adrienne Maree Brown basically says something like, be less right and more in relation. Or put another way, she says something like, less critical mass, more critical connection. She has all kinds of awesome, pithy ways of saying the same thing, but her argument in all of this stuff is also similar to arguments like folks like Kyle Powis White, the Potawatomi climate philosopher, famously I think it's famous because it was in Grist. Okay, so in Grist, you can see his interview in Grist, talks about the origins of the climate crisis not being industrialization, but in the rupture of relationships through colonization. So if one were to say that what ails us in terms of hopelessness, I'm going to go back to hope, I promise, and what ails the planet is this rupture of relationship, if we agree that that's true, and that individualism is fundamentally at odds with that, then to imagine, what would it take to imagine all of our projects, all of our work that we're doing, our own burnout, our own hope, all in the context of being in a collective, or prioritizing relationships over righteousness or winning or outputs and deliverables or other things. That also challenges the question of urgency because, of course, a perception of time scarcity and urgency around any kind of movement, including climate, that can disrupt relationships too. Urgency is often the ploy of people in power to get things done without consulting everybody and including everybody at the table. So there's all kinds of things that come out of this one particular concrete step, which I think of as very concrete because we can practice being in right relation all the time, every day, all the time. And that includes some things like slowing down so you notice stuff, right? And attend with your attention as a form of love to stuff, which then creates this positive feedback loop to go to joy and pleasure and awe and delight, which we've talked about as a group so many times. The brain is wired for those feelings that are pleasurable, and we will tend to do this work much more, and it magnifies and magnifies and magnifies. This question of the environmental term, do I have hope in the environmental term? Like Priscilla, I think I've sort of thrown it out, right? It has lost, it's all that's solid is melted into the air or something, right? I don't really, it has its utility, there's strategic utility for it. And again, as a person who's a chair of an environmental studies department, I think my students find it very strange when I say, I'm not an environmentalist, why would you ever think that? Like, why are you making that assumption? Don't expect me to do anything good, right? I'm just studying this stuff. But it's interesting that Diana Davis directed me to environmental stuff as a social justice lens to get social justice stuff done. But then my dissertation chair, Sherry Hundorf, she asked me at the end of my dissertation, you'll probably remember because you were there, she said, well, given everything that's wrong with an environmental movement that you've just laid out in this whole dissertation, is the environment a worthwhile lens through which to get to social justice? So it all came around full circle, and I'll never forget the question because I felt like I had to say yes, but by the end of it, I said, I don't know, maybe not. So I am still at this kind of place where sometimes there's utility, sometimes there's not. Other kinds of concepts resonate in different social justice movements more than environmental, and I think that's more interesting to me. What are the ways that potato farmers in Idaho are extremely right-wing. How are they engaging with environmental issues? How about the shrimp farmers in Louisiana who are also fairly right-wing, dealing with pollution that is causing serious threats to their subsistence? They're not using climate even as a term for the concerns that threaten their thriving. Yet they're engaging very much in environmental politics. And so to me, I'm not really sure if I need the lens, but there is some utility if you are trying to coalition build. So, and then, yes, of course, to go to the concrete action, but beneath that question, what I hear too is I don't feel sufficient enough in what I'm doing. And I think my second book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, is very much speaking to the sense of inefficacy that most of my students sense, and this constant kind of almost frenetic questioning. What should I do? What should I do? I can't sit here in this classroom. I got to get to action, 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 action. This sort of fetishizing of action over the work of maybe something that's less obvious as action or less spectacular as action, like caregiving or relationship repair or stuff that's much slower, stuff that doesn't make the news. I'm really sounding like Rebecca Solnit now, right? If you're familiar with her work, she talks a lot about this kind of thing. And I think it's fascinating that the research shows that a lot of people talk about deal with your anxiety by getting into action. This is a constant headline, right? And it's in fact not true. The research shows that when people alleviate their anxiety or hopelessness or powerlessness around environmental problems, it is not because of the action, it actually is because of the joining in the collective. So if you disaggregate in the research, it's not actually feeling like you're achieving the ends of achieving utopia that makes people feel better. And that's what I'm hearing underneath the question, right? The sense of kind of frenetic powerlessness, like what do I do with this sense of not being able to fix this? The healing there, the soothing there comes from connection, and so that circles back to the original point, yeah.
Thank you. And I think that's a perfect way. I think the ways in which Malini's question dovetailed with Ella's question, I'm going to actually kind of lend inspiration to that too, so that we can get as many voices as possible here. So I'm going to combine Gabriella's question with JP probably. So Gabriella, do you want to come in first, and then we'll hand the mic to JP, and then we'll see how y'all want to respond accordingly.
Hi, thank you. I'm gonna read from my question so I don't. But for me, this is actually inspired by like the work with Latinx Environmentalisms, the class, and then Tuck and Yang's piece. And so my question is, what do you see as the role of Latinx environmentalisms in movement making and coalition building in this particular political moment with the D word and other words that we can't say? And I'm especially, I'm especially interested in the relationship between the cultural imaginary and the physical embodiment of being part of current movements for decolonial justice and liberation. That's my question.
Okay, I don't want to sound like that guy who uses a question as statement time, but I will preface that this question might be a little long. I think I was encouraged by Dr. Vasquez's like probing of cities to think about this question, and then some of the dichotomy that you were setting up, Professor Wald or Dr. Wald. So there are forms of social organization driven by oppressive means that often in their midst, I mean most of the time, give rise to social organizations of resilience or active resistance to those same structures in a counter-hegemonic way. Fred Moten engages with this idea in the university, and it seems like, you know, over the past 100 years, the sort of organizing that happens on universities follows three traditions: a sort of solidaristic one in which students leverage their power as a constituency against the institution to win demands for the neighbors, a sort of direct one that wins instrumental demands for students or the community itself within the institution, or a third one which is sort of symbolic, that utilizes the sort of idea of what young people are, what students are, to, you know, sort of like what we see going on with like ceasefire calls and stuff right now. with all that being said, what opportunities do you feel like exist for the climate, environmental, perhaps those are the wrong words to even use, for the movement that we all sort of are, in a hesitant way, a part of? What opportunities exist, and what does the role of environmentalism as a label that those movements accept or deny play in creating those opportunities?
Great questions.
I don't have an answer to all of those wonderful questions, but I want to add in, as you were talking, I was thinking about another way in which social movements have engaged with the university. And I'm thinking here about the writings of Zach Schwartz-Weinstein and some others about the universities as a site of labor, and that we often focus on students and not in all of the different kinds of labor movements that have occurred on campuses that have included students but have not been limited to students. And thinking about how your frame, I know the conversation we had earlier about the Sunrise Movement and the sort of New Green Deal, Green New Deal, what that sort of means to then think about the climate movement in relationship to the labor movement on campuses as well, was sort of my initial response to your fantastic question.
I guess I would say, a couple things. So, this goes back to like a long kind of history of thinking about the ways in which certain impositions of power never come without like resistance to that power, which is like kind of what Moten is thinking about, and Jose Munoz and others are thinking about. And I guess, like for me, part of the problem with the left historically is that, like we engage in struggle and then like for whatever reason, like gains are achieved, or like, like counterinsurgency strategies are used to kind of, put down the struggles or whatever. And then we act like those struggles are won and over, right? And that's actually not what history teaches us, right? In fact, history teaches us that the right pushes back, there's co-optation that takes place, like all these dynamics. And so I think that part of what's valuable about, thinking coalitionally, thinking about the kinds of work that we do in environmental justice struggles or whatever, is to think about the ways in which we can engage in ongoing forms of struggle. And to also think about, the ways in which, the kind of immediacy of the crisis of climate change provides us with, a different kind of opportunity. Like, I don't think that it's, like, look, it's not the only existential threat we've ever faced. It's maybe, like, it is an important one, but it's maybe not even the most important one. Like, and in some ways, I think it's important for us to use these moments as opportunities for coalition building, right? Like, less to think about the kind of instrumentality of struggle or about, like, yes, we definitely want to keep, like, warming down. Yes, like, having water inundate New York City is not a great idea. But I think also, like, what are the opportunities for building connections with, the proverbial shrimp farmers or potato farmers, right? Because, like, these are moments where their interests might come together. And when we think about that, I'm really persuaded by Cristina Beltran, who is a political scientist, work where she says, basically, the way that we've thought about political struggle is completely wrong, because we always think about people, like, needing to have, like, all of the things lined up. And she says, no, like, what we really need to do is think about, like, where do people's interests lies, and how can that help us to sort of explain why people coalesce in the ways that they do, right? And that actually is, like, a much more useful frame for me in thinking about these kinds of questions. And to Gabriella's question, I think also, like, we have been thinking a lot in a new project, Priscilla, Sarah Wald, and I, about coalition building as a kind of undisciplining strategy for resisting some of the ways that power gets worked out in the academy, specifically in relation to the kinds of work that are authorized, the kinds of objects of study that are legitimized, and the ways in which we are rewarded or punished within the university system for thinking about, like single-authored books or single-authored articles and that kind of stuff versus like collaborative work. And like we actually have the privilege now, since we're all tenured professors, to be able to do a different kind of work. But it's been very, very important for us to think about pushing this work forward. And we're very much inspired by the work that we've done in Latinx environmentalisms. But it's been really helpful to think about the lessons that we have learned as a way to kind of do other kinds of work that push against these models moving forward.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick up on something you were just saying there, Dave, and I don't know if, I'm hoping it responds to sort of both your questions or mushes them together in some way. I'm just going to use by way of example. On my campus, in the many spaces I'm in environmental studies, we're in this funny place where both undergraduates and there's a graduate program too, their environment and community it's called, that attract people from the hardcore natural sciences all the way to the kind of activists, humanities, social justice folks. So a wide range of positionalities and general enlightenment around questions of race and privilege and how that shapes people's environmental values. And if you just throw these people in a room together in a classroom and expect the individualistic model of higher education or the colonial model of higher education to work, where you just deliver content to these empty vessels and assume that they're going to go out and reproduce them in life, to your point, to your question, Gabrielle, it's not working anymore. I'll just put it that way. It's not working anymore. The classroom doesn't work that way for me anymore, and it has been a real revelation to me after reading Adrienne Brown and thinking about how the classroom space is radical. I mean, I think Bell Hooks put it beautifully. She said something like, the classroom is the only radical space left in the academy. And I take that as a real exciting invitation, right? Whew, what can we do in the classroom then? And if in fact relationship is the number one thing we can do, to Ella's question earlier, then how do we practice that in the classroom? And especially, it is this coalition building point and the Beltran quote or person that you mentioned talking about the different kind of coalescing of interests, it means that we're not going to agree and that these students are going to, all the messes that they're bringing in and all the different traumas and backgrounds and perspectives that they're going to come up and mush against each other and have conflict is going to be actually the lab for whatever kind of work these students think they're going to go do in their jobs and lives in activism. And if they don't actually practice ways to not replicate the same problems that they're learning out in social media and the violent communication models that we see in public discourse, if we don't actually create those kinds of new models and practice new modes and make it very explicit, I'm talking about make it the whole semester worth of material of how do we talk to each other, how do we coalition build, how do we deal with our nervous systems, to go to bodies. I keep wanting to bring bodies back in for you. We're not going to be able to do this work out in the world. And to go back to Adrienne Brown, she wrote a beautiful book called We Will Not Cancel Us. And it's a tiny book, it's a great book. She basically says the movement spaces that are constantly canceling each other have completely missed the point, and they're doing the oppressor's work for them. And in the classroom space, when students have conflict with each other, it's inevitable in these environmental spaces because of these epistemological, variation of epistemological orientations to solving these big urgent environmental problems. Oh, bye. What's happening? Sorry. Should I shut up? I should stop.
Another book
Okay.
thing to go to,
Oh,
but
no.
we still
Okay.
have a little bit of time, so please
Okay.
finish your thought, and then we'll
Okay.
do one
Yes.
round of last
Melanie,
round of
thank you so
questions.
much.
Yes,
Thank you so
Melanie.
much. Okay. Clapping or anything? Okay, yeah. Thank you. This was an anticlimactic departure. Sorry. I'll finish up. So the the work of what the dynamic is in the classroom as this radical space of challenging systems and then going out and figuring out how to practice those skills in the work that you're doing, that to me has become the entire priority of what sort of movement work can happen in the classroom. And I actually looked to, if you want to check it out, you probably already know about it, but Movement Generation's website, they're out of Oakland, they have this huge treasure trove of pedagogy that's all open access. And I mean, it's pedagogy. I think it's college pedagogy. So instead of just getting a PhD in environmental science studies and policy and then going into classrooms and just imparting some sort of expertise, which now seems completely bogus. Educators ought to be trained in movement strategy and then bringing that to students, in my opinion. Thank you. Yeah.
Great, and I think this leads us to our very last round of questions. We have one student question. I would like to kind of open the floor too for any questions that want to come in from the floor. We'll collect those and do one last round as a grand finale. Yeah?
Well, hi, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting conversation. So what I wanted to ask has to do, I know you guys are all very deep in the academic field, but you kind of touched on some alternate forms of knowledge, like Ana Castillo being like a visual artist, some poets, fiction writers. And so I guess I wanted to know, like, what would you say is like the value or the role of these alternate forms of knowledge in like the environmental movement and the decolonial movement and that sort of thing?
Other questions from the floor? We'll just collect all of them together. If not, please do.
I would love to respond to that question with just a historical example. When playwright Luis Valdez, whose play Zoot Suit was made into a Broadway play and then a film, which you can watch today. When he was graduating from college, he learned about the United Farm Workers Movement, and he went out there and he said, "I'm going to go see what I can do." And he talked to Cesar Chavez, and Cesar Chavez said, "Well, what can you do?" And he says, "Well, I know how to write plays." And he said, "Well, then write some plays." And what ended up happening is that he wrote plays, and farm workers starred in them and co-wrote the plays too. And that was a really important way that leaders were born in the movement. And they ended up traveling all over the country and all over the world, speaking to packed rooms and promoting their boycotts. But it was in the process of cultivating their roles as performers with their community that they cultivated their leadership. And I love that story, that Luis Valdez tells that story. And I tell that story to my students often because it's too easy to maintain a boundary between social movements or cultural production, and your question is really, asking us to cross that boundary. So that's one example that I love, and that I think that stuff like that happens all the time. We just don't always get to hear the story about it, right? So.
I mean, I can give one additional example that comes to mind. So in the collection, we have a wonderful essay by Jennifer Garcia Peacock where she talks about the history of the poster Sun Mad, which if you haven't seen this poster, you must see it. It is, everybody's seen the Sun-Made raisin box. You know what that looks like. The artist Esther Hernandez replaces the Sun Maiden, who herself has a very interesting labor history, with a skeleton, with a calavera, and it is a way of recuperating the kind of brutal labor in the production of raisins, but also has an anti-toxics message. And part of what's going on in that poster is that Hernandez is giving us a kind of language for thinking about labor and toxicity and environmental harm together, but in a way that sort of colonizes that original image. So you can actually go see this image. It hangs in the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and you can go there and actually stand in front of it and see it. And if you see it, and especially if you see it in person, but even if you just Google it, like you can never see the Sun-Made Raisins box again, right? Like it colonizes that image, right? And it recuperates a piece of that which drops out of it, right? So out of the original Sun-Made image, which like really tries to get us to think that like the production of raisins is easy and bountiful and all these sorts of things. So I think that like that's another instance where cultural creation can really get you to see something that is there, but maybe that you don't have a language to talk about, right? Or to think about. So I think that like cultural creators are like that kind of clutch in the engine that help us to kind of move from one power state to another.
I'll make it quick. What I hear in the question is a sort of assumption that in dominant culture, the arts and the sphere of cultural change is not the prioritized or valorized arena for major change. And as a person who has a background in the humanities, I'm really sympathetic to that anxiety. And I often sort of try to calm my students with their science inferiority complex, which is oftentimes environmental studies students versus environmental science students. But it turns out, there's all kinds of research that shows this that I think is pretty amazing, that if you think about leverage points of change in a system, which is really drawing on Donella Meadows' work in systems theory, that the highest bang for buck for the kinds of changes that we can make are actually not in politics or economic, leverage points or incentives or regulations, but in mindsets and things that happen at the level of the heart and mind. And that is culture change. And I think Sarah put it beautifully in the beginning. I even wrote down because I wanted to make sure I came back to it somehow. But the culture shifts actually drive material and structural changes, and that's systems theory. So to me, that's radically liberating. That means what we're doing in this room right now is the sphere of the most important cultural change that we can, or systems change that we can do. So to me, that anxiety about, maybe culture change or artistic production or the radical imagination or how my heart and body feel or what my frameworks of thinking about things or the stories I tell things in are just sort of afterthoughts or ways of translating the sciences or economics or ways of making sense of truths that other people produce is in fact completely wrong. And so I kind of want to push back on the very assumption that that isn't the dominant way that people actually make decisions in the world. So yeah, I kind of want to throw out the inferiority complex entirely. Yeah.
I think what I want to say amplifies the conversation we've already been having rather than saying something that's a break from it. But I will hear this question about alternate forms of knowledge, and I think a lot of what we've been saying today is about the knowledge that is created through conversation, the knowledge that's created from collaboration, rather than the model of what in some ways we've been doing here, which is sort of having a panel of experts sort of impart knowledge. And I think that the knowledge that's going to come out of collaboration and conversation is going to be a more powerful embodied knowledge that gives life to social movements and the power of social movements historically and in the future. And I think that we have to think alongside of that of experiential knowledge, the experiences of others and our own experiences, and how do we bring that into a decentering of traditional forms of academic knowledge. And I think that's really at the heart of many of the questions we've been hearing today. And I think in many ways, I think at the heart of some of the kinds of work we're trying to do.
Well, I think that's a perfect, actually, ending point. Thank you, Sarah, for that. I think this is, exactly why we wanted to have this event. And I want to thank all of you for your participation and to the audience for sitting and listening to this incredible conversation, to our students who asked such incredibly pointed and useful questions, and to really everyone who made this event happen. We're going to end here. There's still more food. You can talk to the authors, and I just want to encourage those of you who enjoy this kind of format of talking about books and thinking about books instead of the kind of classic just listening to the author or the editor talk. Our next event is also this kind of moderated conversation book talk. It is off campus at Creative Grounds Bookstore. It is co-sponsored with Bowl Worker-owned Bookshop and Cafe on November 29th, and it is actually co-sponsored by ARPC and the Anthropology Department, and is the official American University launch of Dr. Orasanmi Burton's new book, Tip of the Spear. So if any of you have enjoyed taking his classes or thinking with him, please feel free to come to that next event. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to our amazing panelists.